First of all, some objectives. Now, the purpose of the risk theme is to identify risks in the first place, then go on to assess them, and then to control them. And in fact, we are controlling uncertainty, because that, after all, is the definition of a risk. And as a result of that, improve the ability of the project to succeed. Now, the reason why that improves the ability of the project to succeed is when you look at the definition of a risk itself. It's an uncertain event, or indeed a set of events that, should they occur, will have an effect on the achievement of the project's objectives. So being able to identify them in the first place before they occur, assess them, much more of that later, and then go on to apply some form of control to risks will help the project to achieve its objectives. So now a few points about risk in general. First of all, risk is inevitable because, of course, projects enable change, and therefore you'll always have some form of uncertainty, which of course is your risks. Now, risk management should be systematic, not based on chance or ad hoc actions. And as you would expect, PRINCE2 will give you such a system. Now, risk management is, as it says up here, identifying risks in the first place, assessing them, and then going on to control them, and thereby protect the project's objectives. Now, risk management should be cost effective and support good decision making. I'll show you how both of those actually occur. What we mean by cost effective is that the cost of managing the risks should not outweigh the cost of just letting them happen in the first place, to use a simple example. Now, the management of risk will be an ongoing activity throughout the project. Despite what you may think, it's not doing it once up front. It is in fact continuous throughout the project. Now, the objectives here are to determine the risk causes in the first place, understand their likelihood or probability, to use another word, what impact they will have, when they should occur, the timing, and what sort of responses could we apply to either minimise or remove such risks. So effective risk management is mandatory if you really want to ensure continued business justification and a viable business case. Now, this last bullet is important because it shows you the very direct relationship between the management of risks and business justification. Now, so what is risk management? Well, a risk is measured by a combination of the probability of a perceived threat or indeed an opportunity occurring in the first place, and the magnitude, how big if you will, of its impact on the project objectives. So you'll learn here in PRINCE2 that there are indeed two flavours of risks. There's a threat, which is the definition that you'd normally apply to a risk. In other words, it's something which you don't want to happen. And then there's a positive variant of it called an opportunity, and they are both different flavours of risk. So why is that? Well, a threat is an uncertain event having a negative impact on the project objectives. And yes, you've guessed it, an opportunity is the reverse. It'll have a positive impact on the objectives. So why do we both call them risks? The answer is because they are joined by probability or likelihood, and therefore both need to be managed. You'd be right if you assumed that threats need to be managed such that they are either removed or minimised, and opportunities are to be managed so that they are likely to occur. And when we talk about the project objectives, these are the 6 that you learned about in Module 1. The achievement of benefits, the scope of the project, what's included and what isn't. Therefore, threats may reduce the scope, whereas opportunities may, for example, increase it, if that's an advantage, of course. Costs, similarly, meeting quality requirements, time, you could have delays here due to risks. And of course, risk itself is one of the aspects, as I've just mentioned, that needs to be managed. Now in PRINCE2, you'll find this systematic approach is actually a 5-step approach. Step 1 is to identify the risks. Step 2 is assess them. Step 3 is to plan the responses, in other words. And step 4 is to implement the responses and to check they're having the desired effect. Step 5 is continuous and is relative to all of the first 4, and that is communicate. First of all then, throughout the process, risk information must be communicated with the project as well as to key stakeholders. And in order for risk management to be effective, there are 4 elements you need to be aware of. The first is that risks that might affect the project achieving its objectives need to be identified, captured on the risk register as it happens, and described with clarity so that everyone has a common understanding of what that risk is. The other aspect is controlled. This is where each risk needs to be assessed to understand its probability of occurring, its impact should it occur, and its timing, also known as proximity, so that it can be prioritised. Now, if you've ever been on a time management course, you've probably learned about making to-do lists of actions that need to occur and prioritising them in some way. But there's two ways of doing this. An activity needs to be prioritised by its urgency and its importance. So you may find some activities that need to be done urgently. Let's suppose it's Friday lunchtime and you need to get your weekly timesheet in. Well, you wouldn't call that hugely important, but nevertheless it is certainly urgent, so probably you ought to do that first. Then the other flavour of activity that you'll learn about in time management is importance, and this normally talks about a high impact. So coming back to risks, can you see here that proximity has some bearing on that? If a risk were to occur, and it would occur very close to this moment, then you want to focus your actions on that particular risk. Whereas you may have a risk whose impact is much higher, and therefore may need to be prioritised higher. However, if that risk was unlikely to happen in this management stage, but highly likely in the next management stage, again, you'd carry out the urgent actions first. The third step is assessed. This is where you determine what responses you can make to each risk, and each of these need to be planned, then assigned to people to action and own. It might be yourself, for example. Then such actions need to be implemented, and then the final step is monitoring how effective those actions are, and controlling them simply means modifying them if necessary in order to obtain the desired effect. And the fourth thing to bear in mind is something called the overall risk exposure. That really refers to the aggregation of all the risks. And this needs to be kept under review, together with the impact of these risks on the overall business justification for the project. Now, the reason why this is important is because it may be that the aggregated level of risk is far worse than the likely benefits to be obtained from the business case of carrying out the project. Or it may not refer to the entire project, but merely a situation within the project, such as outsourcing some of the work to a third party. You may find that the risk is out of proportion to the benefits to be obtained, and therefore you decide to carry out the, let's say, creation of products within your own organisation.